All right. I promised you before break that I would explain this the rest of the way. So if you're just joining us at home. All right. So the basic pump, oops, I lost my laser. The basic pump would just come through here and go around this way and then out. So if I'm at the drive end, which way is this pump? Clockwise or counterclockwise? Clockwise from the drive end. All right, so it's coming through here. But as we said, you have to have some mechanism to relieve pressure that could get built up so that we don't blow things up. So what's happening here is, actually, do know they had that. All right, so we're not going to talk about that spring. But what's going on here, you have a much heavier spring with an adjustment up here. And this part right here that's kind of shaped like a valve comes down and seats right here. And so normally it's seated down here. And fuel comes through here and comes through here. And it can come up in here, but it doesn't do anything. And when the pressure builds up enough to overcome this spring pressure, it pushes this up and allows fuel to start leaking through here and back around to the inlet side of the pump. Very directly inlet side of the pump in this case. So it's coming through here, pressure builds up, comes through here, and goes down. And in this way, you can somewhat regulate the pressure output of the pump. So if I blocked this off right here, all the pump would do is come through here, come and push this up off its seat and come back around. Now, something to remember when you're working on your pump in the lab is that springs, as you compress them, what happens to the spring? They get a little bit stronger. So this is, as you can't just set this for, say, 10 psi and expect it to always be 10 psi. So if I set this screw up, and that's how I'm going to do it, I would screw this, and I would say, okay, I want it, if I blocked this off and said, well, I want this pump to only be at 10 psi, and anything over 10 psi, it has to bypass out. Well, and I put a little pressure gauge right here, and so I start the pump up, and I'm running it kind of slow, and I set it for 10 psi, it'll run at 10 psi all day. But what happens is, as I increase the speed of the pump, what's the pump going to do?
More.
It's going to pump more. And because it pumps more, what does this have to do?
Let more out.
It's got to let more out. So in order to let more out, it's got to go higher, which means it's going to push on the spring a little bit more. So you're going to see the pressure rise a little bit just because of the nature of it. And at some point, this is going to go all the way to the top. And if I keep increasing the speed of this pump, what happens? Something's going to give. So you're still limited. So this can only bypass so much. If it's designed, I suppose, with the same size, it'll bypass as much as it needs to. But anyway, so that's what it's going to do. If I slow the pump down far enough and it's only pumping a little bit, and I have I got to get rid of my restriction. So we just have a little orifice here, so it's pumping out. So ideally, this will be on its seat. Then as the pump starts building up pressure, or it starts pumping more, and the pressure here starts building up, it's got to relieve it, so it just comes back around and comes through here. So that's how it does it. And how do you do it? You adjust this. Which way do you think you would screw this to make the pressure go higher? To increase pressure. You'd be right. Turn it clockwise, just like you're tightening a nut. And you'll see. Remember that. It's just like you think. You're going to get to a spot in an oral, and I promise you at least half the class is going to tell me it's the other way around. So it's not. Turn it to the right, pressure goes down. Pressure, you get more pressure, unscrew it, less pressure.
So the volume which goes through the bypass valve is not the same volume as the pump inlet is.
Correct. I'm assuming I don't have it blocked off, because why would I? But in some cases you could. Let's just say this is going to a carburetor and have it idle cutoff. How much fuel is going through the carburetor? Huh?
Nothing.
Nothing. So this is going to a carburetor or the pump outlet. That's what its job is going to be for. And the carburetor is an idle cutoff. No fuel is flowing through idle cutoff, so it has to bypass all of it. But how fast is the engine running at idle cutoff?
0.
0. So would that scenario ever happen? No.
I only wonder why someone would design it with less capability to go around, because I don't know, for some reason, if the outlet gets blocked or if someone runs the pump faster, then the output kind of lets out. Then I'm kind of doomed by breaking something.
Oh,
While
so
if I would,
so from an engineering standpoint, you're asking me if all the pumps are engineered so that this bypass is large enough to handle as much inlet as, I don't know, probably.
yeah, because that would kind of be smart.
It'd be the smart way to go. But then you start thinking about, well, then they can build it smaller, do this. I don't know. I didn't engineer it.
Okay.
So, wait a minute. It's somebody. So Ivan.
When we start the engine, we start with starter. So anyway, we start rotational engine. So this full displacement pump will start work.
Yes, as soon as the engine starts to crank, this will start to work.
So
So that pressure adjustment only works when you're basically below your set pressure and then creeping up a little bit higher, like 12 pounds instead of 10 pounds.
Okay. I'm not sure I understood the question, but what's that?
If you go way up over what your pressure adjustment is set for, it really doesn't work anymore.
In a way. So if I set this at one point at exactly 10 psi and sped the pump up, a lot, at some point it's going to start creeping up, 10, 11, 12, 13, and then it could get to a point where it could be quite a bit. So I shouldn't say that. It's just going to creep up on you. So don't freak out if you're like, I set it for 10 and now it's 10 and a half and 11. So it just does that.
So is there a certain RPM that you're supposed to have the engine to be able to set the output PSI?
Yes. So it's all in the manual. So it'll tell you when setting this up, set the PSI outlet for X number of PSI, and so you're going to set that. Now when you get into Continentals, it's extremely difficult and precise.
I want to guess, depending on your restriction, that's how you would set it up, right?
Yes. Hannah.
When the fuel comes back around to the inlet, doesn't that increase pressure on the inlet side?
It really doesn't.
Okay.
Nah, it's just not necessarily.
It's
Just kind of recirculates around and it's fine, and then this just gets stagnant.
Okay.
So, because you think about you have a boost pump that's putting it this way, but the boost pump is not constant displacement, it's centrifugal. So if it's just going to put out 5 psi, you can have 5 psi here, and this is just going to flow around. So it doesn't really not supposed to add any pressure to it.
Okay.
All right, who else had a question?
I
All
just
right.
made a little observation.
Yeah?
You said it would never happen if when you put it back on idle cutoff.
The engine dies.
Well, what if someone forgot to put the sleeve into the metering valve into the sleeve?
Then you don't have idle cutoff, and
Yeah.
fuel keeps flowing.
Exactly.
And this type of this type of pump isn't used on that type of carburetor.
Okay, cool. All right.
It's a pressure carburetor type. All right, so we kind of clear on how this bypass is working. All right, now we can get a little more complicated. So now we're going linear, so that's good. All right. When the engine is not working, we want to start the engine. Well, this is a constant displacement pump. So that means fuel cannot get through here when this is stopped. Fuel's going to come here and hit that vein and it's done. It doesn't go through here at all. So this blocks fuel from flowing. So if I want to start my engine and you can obviously see how it's going to work, but the reason why is the fuel comes through, it stops here. But in this case, the boost pump is going to put some pressure up here, and this is a weak spring. It's not designed at all to regulate pressure or to even block it. It's just strong enough to hold this plate against these holes. That's all it's going to do, just enough to keep this plate up here. And so as soon as any type of pressure comes this way, it will flow through and around and go to the carburetor. So it's just a bypass right there. So if this were to shear and stop working, if the engine is not running, it's an easy way for fuel just to get around. It's the bypass.
There's holes in the bypass valve.
There are a lot of holes. And it doesn't even not be this way. It's just the way they decide to draw it.
Okay.
Back here, as soon as the pump outlet pressure exceeds the boost pump, this pressure is higher than this pressure, the plate goes up, and then that stops it, and then the fuel goes that way.
So will you be kind of limping back on that because your boost pump's only going to be at, say, 5 psi compared to?
Well, I'm just throwing out PSI. No. So in reality, with the exception of the Continental fuel system, fuel injection, the boost pump is more than enough to handle the load. You wouldn't even notice it. The Continental, you're going to lose about 75% power. And you guys will figure out why when we get there, because it's a very unique pump.
75%.
You will be at 75% power. You'll lose about 25%.
How is the bypass plate held on to the spring? Like, does it ever get loose?
PF into.
Yeah, I know. There's so many different types of pumps, so many different ways. It can be a diaphragm. It can be built onto it. Remember, this is just a representation. This isn't the actual pump. No.
One like that ever come with?
I'm sure it's possible. Yes.
So, is that plate if in the
This plate.
inlet, the
This plate?
bypass valve plate?
Yeah?
So you said there's holes above there. So what
Yeah.
stops the fuel pressure from going the opposite way?
Back this way?
Yeah.
The weak spring. So as this weak spring tries to push the plate back up here.
Okay.
The only thing pushing it down is the pressure from here right now.
So the weak spring just basically covers the holes that are there.
It just helps this to stay in place.
Okay.
Now remember that the one thing this is not showing is diaphragms. All right, so sometimes there's diaphragms in here. It's designed different. They're not exactly like this. It's just a representation to help you understand how it works. All right, we add a layer of complexity. This is a compensated fuel pump. What happens as we go up in altitude? What happens to the fuel system?
It's richer.
Glad one person knows. It's going to enrich it. Do I want it to get richer as I go up in altitude?
No.
No. So I'm going to be leaning it out. If I lean it out, I need
Mixture control.
I need less fuel. Well, compensated fuel pump is somebody's idea that says, hey, you know what? I understand that you're going to need less fuel, so why don't I help you out and drop the pressure a little bit as you go out? Wouldn't that be nice? So what happens with this one is there's a little vent chamber. Now, this can do two things right here. So my scenario, it's just open and we're going up in altitude. And in this scenario, what happens is there's less pressure on this chamber, which is assisting the spring. So it's a spring assist. So I come down and I'm at low altitude. I have pressure on here helping the spring to keep this closed, which means I'll have more or less pressure? More pressure. So more pressure. Now I go way up in altitude and there's less atmospheric pressure. And so is it helping the spring or kind of less help? So less help. Now it's just the spring. So you see I can add or subtract from the spring a little bit. Well, let's take this and do something else with it. Let's run this line to what we call upper deck pressure, which upper deck pressure is now we're talking about an engine that has a turbocharger on it. So now I'm going to sense turbocharger outlet pressure. And if I don't have much turbocharger pressure, does it help the spring? No, spring's on its own. Now I hit the throttle, and that boost pressure goes way high. So now I got a lot of boost pressure. What do you think I need with fuel?
Need more fuel. A lot more.
I need a lot more fuel. Why do I need more fuel?
Because you're spinning the engine faster.
Because you're adding more
Cooling.
I am spinning the engine faster, but I've increased that boost pressure, that manifold pressure. We'll just call it manifold pressure. So what do I have inside the manifold pressure? More air. If I have more air, I need more fuel. Okay, so turbocharger, you just got to think about, we're kind of used to talking about sea level and then going up to altitude. Well, in a turbocharger, what if I went below sea level? The air gets really thick. So in a way, some turbochargers allow you to, act like you're way below sea level. So if you're way below sea level, you're going to need more fuel, right? So there you go. So I can tie this into that turbocharger. So turbochargers, they're a little slow to spool up. There can be some lag, so that's one thing. So as the so I hit the throttle and I want a lot of pressure, but the system is really saying, wait a minute, you want a lot of pressure because you think there's going to be turbocharger boost, but yet there is no turbocharger boost, so maybe we should just hang on a second here, right? This is a good way to hang on a second here. So you ask for more power, more fuel. This is going to speed up and go, but your pressure is going to stay kind of low. Then the turbocharger is going to start spooling up and start helping the spring and saying, all right, now we're ready for some more pressure. And so now more pressure is going to flow through there. So that is a compensated fuel pump. Now, some of the things that I can ask you questions on to think about is, let's just go back to our not turbocharged. We'll talk a lot more about turbochargers during that week. But I've got it just like this, and it's just sensing atmospheric pressure. And I take off here on a nice spring day, and I go up in my high altitude Cessna 180, and I'm way up at altitude, and a bug gets ingested in here and sticks right there. You see his little butt hanging out. And then I start descending, and I land here. What is going to happen to my pressure? Is it going to do what? It's going to go lean. Why? Because I have low pressure in here that's actually kind of fighting it. And so it's going to go lean. Right? Do the same, the opposite. What if this gets plugged up and then I start climbing? Well, then it's going to act like it wasn't there. So you can see what happens if you have low pressure or high pressure in here. All questions that I'm going to ask you when you start working on these in your oral. And that is not for now. All right, so that's the rotary vane pump. So now we can write some things about it. Let's see, operation. So operation. Utilizes an eccentric. Eccentric, not eccentric. Rotor. Driven inside the cylinder.
Should be eccentric.
Yeah, I spelled it the wrong way.
EXC.
Thank you. EXCENTRIC, I think. Eccentric. Nah, it doesn't look right.
I thought it was 2 feet. I thought you had it right.
Well, now I don't know. Somebody's got to look it up. You got to get it right.
That's in German.
Eccentric.
I know what you meant.
ECCEN. The first one is spelled.
ECCENTRIC. I had it right? All right. Sorry, he was going with the German spelling. That's okay. All right. Slots in the rotor allow vanes to slide in and out. Sometimes those vanes are made of steel. Sometimes they're made out of carbon. If they're made out of carbon, you have to be very careful. They're brittle. Sometimes the drum they're in is in carbon too, and then it's very brittle. Let's see, slide in and out. As the vanes rotate, the volume in the cylinder increases and decreases. So as it increases and decreases, remember I said as it's increasing, it creates kind of a low pressure, if you will, that draws fuel in, or it makes a space for the fuel. Then it locks it in that space, it rotates it around, dumps it out this way, and the space gets smaller, so it's got to dump out. Constant displacement pumps are designed to deliver more fuel than needed. You really don't want to design a pump that gives you the exact right amount. Can you open the door? What happens if I design it for just the exact right amount?
If anything goes wrong, then you have too little fuel in yours.
There you go. It's exactly. And what happens? A pump's going to wear. So as it starts to wear, it's like, well, hey, it only works when it's new. Nah, that doesn't work so well. So let's see.
200 hours before it goes bad.
Constant displacement pumps are designed to deliver more fuel than needed. All excess fuel is delivered. Where is it delivered to?
Inlet side.
There you go. Back to the inlet side of the pump. And in this case, it really is right there at the inlet. And as we talked before, sometimes the inlet side of the pump is a long way away from the inlet side of the pump. It'll go all the way to the tank, which is still called the inlet side of the pump. I'm going to put that note. Sometimes, not always, sometimes the inlet side of the pump is the fuel tank. Doesn't always have to be the exact inlet. All right, E, a pressure relief valve. Pressure relief valve adjusts the amount of fuel being returned. Let me see. And thus, the pressure. So the pressure relief valve is just strictly opening and closing, dictating how much fuel gets returned, and through an orifice on the outlet, you can then set the pressure. All engine-driven pumps, or say fuel pumps, must have a mechanism to allow boost pump fuel flow to flow through the pump, which is the bypass mode, for starting and what else?
If it's broken.
And if it's broken, yep. All engine-driven fuel pumps must have a mechanism what? To allow boost pump fuel to flow through the pump. To flow through the pump. And we'll call that bypass. For starting. And if engine driven, pump fails.
On that first pump you showed us, that was a rotary.
The very basic?
I didn't see that bypass.
No, because it was just a basic, and it wasn't a real pump that would actually be working. So it's like, here's the idea for a rotary pump. And actually, I can take that back. You could do something like that. That is a perfect example of a vacuum pump that is on all engines. And there is no bypass or anything else because it's a vacuum pump. So it's the only pump you have, and it's just designed to pump air. And so later in the system, you have to have a relief on it. Some pumps are compensated. Means they get paid for a living. Or balanced. I think there's a Q&A question that calls it a balanced pump. So atmospheric pressure, I could say, or upper deck pressure. What is upper deck pressure? I've used that a couple times. I haven't defined it.
Sounds like a Navy term.
Yeah, Navy term. It's when you go up to the upper decks and they have boats and mates up there, and you know the pressure on you to get away from them. All right, so I'll define that. But upper deck pressure is connected to a vent chamber on the pump. As pressure decreases, that'd be atmospheric pressure or the pressure inside of this vent chamber. So as the pressure decreases, and when would the pressure decrease? Give me an example.
When you climb an altitude.
Okay, altitude increase. Altitude increase, less pressure. Is on the diaphragm. Allowing more fuel to bypass. So what's going to happen to my pressure? Up or down? All right, down. As pressure increases, more pressure is placed on the diaphragm. On the diaphragm, aiding the pressure relief spring and increasing pump outlet pressure. Yes?
When you say more pressure is placed on the diaphragm, you mean pressure from the fuel on the other side?
In the vent chamber. So I'm talking about all pressure decreasing or increasing here.
So you're talking about a different circumstance than, say, going up in altitude. So when you go down in altitude.
If I go down in altitude, then I'm going to get more pressure here. That pressure is going to push down on this. This is the diaphragm, this little red line. So it's a flexible rubber disc. So more pressure is going to be put on that flexible rubber disc. And so since I have all this pressure pushing down on this disc, it aids in this spring. So it's like a super spring. So if I have a super spring, then it's going to push this down and I'm going to get more fuel. So, but if I take and I draw a suction on this, literally, if let's say I put a big syringe on it and pull back on that big syringe, and this was closed, guess what it's going to do?
Open.
It's going to open it. So if I put a vacuum on this, it'll suck this diaphragm up, and it'll actually pull this right up with it. And I'll actually do that with you guys in lab. So you'll be running your pump, and I'm going to ask you, okay, if I put this syringe on and I pull back, what's the pressure and flow going to do? And then you have to tell me what the pressure and the flow is going to do. And I say, all right, so I'll do it, and you'll watch the pressure and flow do something. I say, okay, now what if I push on it? Say, okay, the pressure and the flow should do this. Now, yeah.
So with that, the pressure relief valve basically open and just extra fuel.
This here?
Yeah.
That's the the pressure relief valve. So yes, so it'll pull the pressure relief valve up or force it down.
Right, and fuel basically bypasses the engine-driven fuel pump.
This is the engine-driven fuel pump.
Right.
So yes, it comes back through here like that. Let's see.
Kevin, what
Yeah.
are those? You know the line there below the vent chamber? Those little notches, what are those?
That represents a flexible diaphragm. So it represents flexibility.
Okay.
So while we're kind of talking about this, let's see. All right, so I have an outlet here, and well, we better put a little restriction on it.
You have one.
Huh? Not a nice one. Well, that's not a nice one either. So I have a restriction over here. Harder to do than you think. All right, so I've got this thing flowing, and I've got it set up, and well, now you make me feel bad. That's why we can't have anything nice or get anywhere here. All right. It's very hard to draw straight lines on this little pad here. Do you want to be taught this by an art major?
This portion, yeah.
Oh, there we go. Square. Squares work better. All right, so I have a restriction right there. And if I were to put a pressure gauge,
It's a whole circle.
that's what you're going to get. Or I could just not do any of this and just stand here and talk. Okay. So, thank you. Thank you for your support. All right, so we have a pressure gauge. I also want a flow gauge on here. And flow gauges can, you do that. They can put little wheels on them. Little wheel rotates and tells how much is flowing. You can do that. Or you can have what we have in the lab. Grace, I have to draw parallel lines here, which never works out well. We actually have a column of fuel, and you actually get a little thing there that floats in the fuel. So there's a little space here and a little space there, and as I could connect this right over here, we do that. So as it looks like a jellyfish. So as the fuel flow increases, it makes this thing rise up, and you can actually read how much fuel flow you have based upon that. And it's read right here at this spot right there. And so we can check fuel flow. So you'll actually be doing fuel pressure and flow.
What's the flow measured in?
Huh?
What's the flow measured in, like gallons a minute or?
Yeah, pounds per hour, gallons per minute. It can do whatever. I'm going to put that over here. So here's my flow gauge right here then. There's my flow meter. So let me ask you a couple of questions, and we'll get rid of this flow meter. So I have PSI and I have flow. So PSI is on this side of the orifice, and flow is on that side of the orifice. So I'm running along, and we're happy, and we'll just say we have 10 PSI. And I put my syringe on here, and I pull back on it and create a suction right here. And let's say we're at flow. I'm just going to give it a number of 10. Also 10. 10 what? I have 10 gallons per hour, something like that. All right. So I pull a suction on here. What's going to happen to my PSI right here? I hope everybody catching that.
So where do you put the section?
Right here.
Okay.
Because you're going to open the relief.
Whoa, why did it do that? Suction. All right, so if I put a suction, I'm going to just use a big syringe and pull back on it, create this suction on there. What's going to happen to my PSI? Okay, PSI is going to go down. Why is it going to go down?
Some of the oil.
So pressure adjustment set for 10, and then so the pressure is going to relieve that 10 psi pressure on the spring, which is going to allow pressure to circulate back Less than 10 PSI.
Well put. So that suction is going to act upon this diaphragm, which is going to lessen the effect of the spring, causing this to unseat itself sooner, and the PSI is going to go down. What's going to happen to my flow? My flow is going to go down. Why did the flow go down?
Because less pressure.
There's less pressure, number one. Number two, I had fuel that was going out here through this restriction, but now it's easier for it to go this way. So if it's easier for it to bypass, how much fuel is going this way? Less. So if less fuel is going that way, then the gallons per hour has got to go down. So flow, then flow. Oh, I know what's happening. I got to get rid of this pen thing. Flow is also going to go down. All right, now what if instead of a suction, I put pressure? So I take the same syringe, but now it's out, and I put it on there and I go, and I shove it down on there. Put all this pressure in this vent chamber. What's going to happen?
It's going to force the diaphragm down.
Okay, it's going to force it. So what is it doing to the spring?
Helping it.
It's going to be helping.
Helping the spring. So PSI is going to do what?
Increase.
Increase. Well, not only did the pressure output of the pump increase, and because there's more pressure, that pressure can go through this orifice easier. That means that, and also less is getting bypassed, but that's going to mean that my gallons per hour is going to do also increase.
So that would be the compressor scenario.
Yes, turbocharger. Turbo. All right. No. Discard. I forgot to tell you about. So I said I'd tell you about upper deck. Upper deck pressure is the pressure between the turbo outlet and the throttle body, which is the spot where the throttle is, or we could just say throttle. That's upper pressure between the turbo outlet and the throttle body. What is that normally in an airplane without a turbocharger?
Lower than atmospheric.
What is the between the throttle body and going forward? What is that on a normal airplane? What do we see?
Manifold pressure.
Manifold pressure is actually still manifold pressure, but it's very close. You're just going the other way from the throttle. So follow the throttle going the other way around.
Your air inlet.
Air inlet and the filter and all that and the carburetor heat box. So that's just the pressure between the turbo outlet and the throttle body. So manifold is well, I don't say that is. I know we say manifold pressure is the pressure between throttle body and cylinder. Same thing. Manifold doesn't change. Manifold on a normally aspirated, meaning not turboed, is the same thing. It's the same place, I should say. So, all right. So, are we good with that? All right. The next kind of pump we're going to talk about is called a diaphragm fuel pump. And a diaphragm fuel pump is very common. It's probably the most common type of fuel pump in aviation, especially for light combing. This is mostly what light combing uses. Trying to think, Continental, not so much. I can't even actually think of Continental using this one off the top of my head. And what we're going to do is we are going to watch a video, but that is longer than 10 minutes. So rather than starting that now, we will stop this and